Ron Iddles noticed the pillow long after everyone else stopped looking, and that single mark would expose a killer who had been hiding in plain sight for years. What began as 3 quiet deaths would unravel into a pattern so precise that one overlooked detail became the key to everything. The city treated the first death as an unfortunate event. A middle-aged man was found alone in his home, lying on his bed, with no signs of a struggle. The house was clean, the doors were locked, and nothing appeared out of place. Neighbors described him as quiet and predictable. The medical report suggested a natural cause, and the case was closed without much attention. Life moved on, and the file was archived. 18 months later, another body was discovered. This time it was a woman living on the opposite side of the city. Like the first case, her home showed no damage, no broken windows, no forced entry, and no missing items. The scene felt calm, almost peaceful. Investigators again leaned toward a natural explanation. Stress and health issues were mentioned. The similarity to the earlier case went unnoticed, buried under routine paperwork and busy schedule. The third death came quietly, almost unnoticed by the public. An elderly man was found in a small rental unit. The place was modest but orderly. His bed was neatly made, except for where he had been lying. Once again there were no signs of panic or violence. The conclusion followed the same path as before. Another isolated death. Another file closed. To most people, these events meant nothing beyond brief headlines. Different victims, different locations, different lives. The city saw no reason to connect them. Even experienced investigators trusted the surface details. Nothing about the cases demanded urgency. There was no obvious threat, no visible danger moving through the streets. Ron Iddles encountered the cases much later. They crossed his desk, not as active investigations, but as old files marked complete. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about them. Still, something felt unfinished. The calm nature of each scene bothered him. Death rarely left a room so untouched. It usually carried chaos, confusion, or at least some sign of distress. He began reading slowly, not searching for dramatic evidence, but for small inconsistencies. He noticed that all 3 victims lived alone. Each had a routine that recently shifted. One had started working from home. Another had changed shopping days. The third had begun regular maintenance visits after a long period of isolation. These changes were subtle, but they mattered. Time gaps between the deaths were long enough to erase suspicion. Months passed, then more months. The spacing made the cases feel unrelated. Yet the timing followed a strange rhythm, almost deliberate. It was as if someone knew exactly how long to wait before acting again. Ron paid close attention to the scene photographs. He examined corners of rooms, door frames, and everyday objects. He wasn't looking for what stood out. He was looking for what blended in too well. That was when he noticed something that had been quietly present all along. On each bed, the pillow looked ordinary. White or light-colored fabric, slightly worn. Nothing worth mentioning in a report. But near the edge of each pillowcase was a faint, darkened area. It was not dramatic. It could easily be mistaken for normal wear or skin oil. No one had written it down as evidence. No one had tested it. Yet the mark appeared in the same place every time. It was a small detail, almost invisible in the larger picture. But Ron understood that major cases often turned on minor facts. The city believed these deaths were unrelated accidents, of fate. But that faint mark suggested something else. It hinted that someone had been close enough, long enough, to leave a trace behind. The cases were quiet, but the silence felt intentional. And silence, Ron knew, could be the loudest warning of all. The second phase of the investigation began without urgency. The cases were still considered closed, and no one expected new hubris. Ron Iddles worked alone, reviewing materials during spare hours. There was no pressure from superiors and no public interest pushing him forward. That freedom allowed him to slow down and question assumptions that had gone unchallenged. He returned to the original scene reports and noticed how similar the language was. Words like calm, orderly, and undisturbed appeared again and again. These were comforting terms, often used when investigators wanted to reassure themselves that nothing criminal had occurred. But repetition can hide mistakes. When scenes look too perfect, they can also be staged without anyone realizing it. Ron focused on what was missing, rather than what was present. There were no signs of illness that clearly explained the deaths. No medical history strong enough to justify the conclusions. Toxicology results were vague, offering possibilities instead of answers. Each report leaned heavily on probability rather than proof. The photographs became his main focus. He studied them one by one, comparing angles, lighting, and framing. The crime scene photographers had done their job well, capturing everything in detail. Still, their eyes were trained to document, not to question. Ron looked at the images differently. He imagined the rooms before the photos were taken and after the investigators left. The bedrooms stood out. In each case, the bed was the center of the scene. Not because of violence, but because of stillness. The sheets were smooth. The pillows were placed neatly, not pushed aside or crumpled. This suggested the victims had not moved much before dying. That detail contradicted some of the medical explanations, which would normally involve discomfort or distress. Ron zoomed in on the pillows again. The faint, dark mark he had noticed earlier became harder to ignore. It was dull, slightly shiny under certain lighting, and absorbed into the fabric rather than sitting on top of it. The mark did not match sweat pattern. It lacked the uneven spread typical of natural oils from skin. He checked the evidence logs. The pillows had been collected, bagged and stored, but no tests were requested on the fabric. At the time there had been no reason to suspect anything unusual. The mark was too ordinary to raise concern. Ron requested permission to have the pillowcases re-examined. It was an unusual request for a closed case, but it did not attract resistance. The items were sent to a lab with minimal expectations. Even Ron did not know what he was hoping to find. While waiting for results, he expanded his review. He mapped the victims' movements in the weeks before their deaths. Grocery receipts, appointment cards, delivery records, and maintenance logs were pulled together. Nothing dramatic appeared at first. Just ordinary life, errands, services, small interactions with people who came and went without notice. That was when another pattern began to form. Each victim had recently allowed someone into their bedroom area. Not a guest or family member, but a worker. Someone performing a task that required brief access and raised no suspicion. The visits were routine enough to be forgotten soon after they happened. The lab results arrived quietly. The mark was confirmed to be a grease-based substance, not organic and not normally found in households. It was designed to reduce friction in mechanical parts. The composition was stable and long-lasting, which explained why it remained visible even after washing. This discovery shifted the entire meaning of the scenes. The grease suggested contact, not accident. It implied that someone carrying it had leaned close to the pillow, close enough for transfer. That closeness mattered. The deaths were no longer separate events. They were connected by something that did not belong in any of those homes. The grease mark was small, but it carried weight. It transformed calm rooms into quiet crime scenes, and turned overlooked details into a path forward. What had once looked like coincidence now felt deliberate. And the longer Ron studied the evidence, the clearer it became that the truth had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. The confirmation of the grease changed the tone of the investigation. What had once felt like quiet curiosity now carried real weight. The substance was not random, and it was not common. It was used in specific work environments, mostly by people who handled tools, machines or moving parts. It did not belong in bedrooms, and it did not appear by chance. Ron studied the lab report carefully. The grease had a stable formula, designed to last under heat and pressure. It resisted water and did not break down easily. That explained why the mark stayed visible on fabric for long periods. It also meant the transfer had been direct. Someone had been close enough to the pillow for the grease to rub off. This ruled out many earlier theories. It was not contamination from laundry. It was not residue from furniture. It was not related to the victims themselves. The source had to be a person who carried the grease with them regularly. Ron returned to the timeline. He compared the dates of the grease exposure to the victims' schedules. Each victim had received a service visit shortly before their death. The time gap was small enough to matter, but large enough to avoid suspicion. The visits were logged, paid for, and forgotten. The types of work varied. One involved electrical maintenance, another involved plumbing inspection. The third involved a simple appliance repair. Different tasks, different companies, but similar outcomes. At first, this seemed to weaken the connection, but Ron saw it differently. The variety suggested movement. Someone who did not stay in one place. He examined the grease composition again and compared it to standard products used in those industries. It was close, but not exact. The formula pointed to a specific supplier that served independent companies. This ruled out many earlier theories. It was not contamination from laundry. It was not residue from furniture. It was not related to the victims themselves. The source had to be a person who carried the grease with them regularly. Ron returned to the timeline. He compared the dates of the grease exposure to the victims' schedules. Each victim had received a service visit shortly before their death. The time gap was small enough to matter, but large enough to avoid suspicion. The visits were logged, paid for, and forgotten. The types of work varied. One involved electrical maintenance, another involved plumbing inspection. The third involved a simple appliance repair. Different tasks, different companies, but similar outcomes. At first, this seemed to weaken the connection, but Ron saw it differently. The variety suggested movement. Someone who did not stay in one place. He examined the grease composition again and compared it to standard products used in those industries. It was close, but not exact. The formula pointed to a specific supplier that served independent contractors. These were workers who moved between jobs, often hired temporarily and rarely remembered by name. This realization added a new layer of danger. The person responsible was not tied to a single company or location. They blended in, appearing ordinary and replaceable. They entered homes under normal circumstances and left without leaving obvious traces. Ron requested supplier records. The list was short. Only a few distributors carried that exact grease blend. One supplier stood out. It serviced a small but steady group of contractors across the city. The delivery logs showed repeated purchases over several years. As Ron cross-checked the names, something unsettling emerged. One contractor's work history overlapped with all three cases. Not directly, but close enough. He had worked in the same neighborhoods within weeks of each death, sometimes before, sometimes after. Never long enough to stand out. The twist came when Ron expanded the search further back. He reviewed old case files from years earlier, looking for similar scenes. One file caught his attention. A death ruled as natural, dismissed quickly due to age and health history. The scene photographs showed a familiar calm, a tidy bedroom, a neatly placed pillow, and there it was again, the same faint mark. This fourth case changed the scale of everything. The crimes were not limited to 3 victims. They were part of a longer pattern that had gone undetected. The spacing between deaths was deliberate. Long pauses reduced risk and erased memory. The calm scenes discouraged deeper investigation. Ron felt the weight of time pressing in. Each overlooked detail represented not just a mistake, but a missed chance to stop what was happening. The grease mark was no longer just evidence. It was a timeline, marking how long the truth had been ignored. The investigation now had direction, but also urgency. The person responsible was careful, patient, and methodical. They understood routine and used it as cover. The grease mark had survived not because it was meant to be found, but because it was too ordinary to notice. What once seemed harmless now felt chilling. The substance that kept machines running smoothly had become the thread connecting silent deaths. And as Ron followed that thread, he knew he was getting closer to someone who had counted on being invisible. The investigation shifted into a dangerous phase once a possible suspect profile emerged. The focus moved from evidence to people, and that always carried risk. Ron Iddles knew that chasing the wrong lead could waste months and alert the real offender. Still, the overlap between the contractor's work history and the deaths could not be ignored. The first step was to examine the company most closely connected to the service visits. Employment records were pulled, schedules viewed and background checks updated. One individual stood out due to frequent short-term contracts and sudden job changes. He had access, tools and experience. On paper he fit the outline. Surveillance followed, quiet and cautious. His daily routine was watched. His vehicle was inspected. His equipment was checked for traces of the grease. The early signs seemed promising, but facts refused to align completely. The grease found on his tools was similar, but the formula was slightly different. Close enough to mislead, but not enough to prove anything. Ron pushed further. He reviewed the man's past locations, comparing them carefully to the dates of the deaths. The gaps grew clearer. At least one of the murders occurred when this suspect was confirmed to be in another region. The timeline did not bend, no matter how much pressure was applied. This was the wrong trail. The setback was frustrating, but it revealed something important. The real offender understood how to remain just outside the frame. He moved often. He avoided patterns that could be traced easily. He stayed close enough to crime scenes to act, but far enough to escape blame. Ron returned to the grease itself. Instead of focusing on workers, he focused on supply. He examined distribution routes, delivery schedules, and purchase volumes. This approach removed assumptions and replaced them with data. Grease left records. Someone had to buy it. One supplier's files drew attention again. The quantities ordered were modest but consistent. Not enough to suggest large-scale industrial use. Just enough for personal equipment. The purchases were made under different company names, but the delivery address repeated. That address led to a shared storage facility on the edge of the city. It was rented under short-term agreements, renewed regularly, but never for long. The units were small and unremarkable. The kind of place designed to avoid notice. Inside the records of the storage facility, Ron found something critical. Access logs showed late-night visits that lined up with the weeks before each death. The same access code appeared again and again, even when the company names changed. This discovery reframed everything. The offender was not loyal to any employer. He used companies as cover, stepping in and out of roles as needed. The grease was not just a work tool, it was a constant, something he carried from job to job. Ron then reviewed older service records from across the city, expanding the search window by several years. Another near match surfaced. A fifth death that had raised mild concern at the time, but was dismissed due to lack of evidence. The photos showed the same quiet order, the same undisturbed bed, the same faint mark. The pattern was no longer subtle, it was deliberate. The wrong suspect had served a purpose. He proved that appearances could deceive and that similarity was not the same as Ruth. The real offender had survived by staying ordinary and forgettable. He relied on systems that assumed trust and routine. By stepping away from people and following objects, Ron had narrowed the field. The investigation was no longer scattered. It had a center. The pieces were aligning, not through force but through patience. The case was closing in on someone who had believed time would protect him. But time, Ron knew, also preserved mistakes. And the smallest mistake had already been left behind on a pillow waiting to be followed to its source. The final stage of the case unfolded quietly, without public attention or urgency from above. Ron Iddles understood that this was the most dangerous moment. The person responsible had operated for years by staying unnoticed. Any sudden pressure could cause him to disappear again. Everything had to be done carefully, step by step. The storage facility became the center of the investigation. Ron reviewed rental records stretching back nearly a decade. One individual appeared repeatedly, always under different company details, always using short contracts. The name changed, but the identification documents followed a narrow pattern. Small variations, just enough to pass routine checks. From there, Ron traced work histories linked to those identities. The same pattern emerged. Temporary roles, maintenance jobs, short visits to private homes. The work provided access without suspicion and an excuse to be close to bedrooms. Nothing about the jobs seemed unusual on their own. Physical evidence sealed the connection. Tools recovered from the storage unit carried the same grease formula found on the pillowcases. The chemical match was exact. Fibers from pillow fabric were also present, trapped in worn seams and tool grips. The transfer was unintentional, careless in a way that only happens when someone believes they are safe from scrutiny. The timeline was reconstructed one final time. Each death followed a service visit. Each visit was followed by a long pause. The spacing was intentional, designed to erase memory and avoid patterns. The offender had relied on time to protect him, believing that delayed crimes became invisible. The arrest itself did not bring drama. There were no crowds, no flashing lights, no resistance. It ended the same way the crimes had been carried out, quietly. The city barely noticed. As the case files were updated, older deaths were reopened. Some could not be proven beyond doubt, but the pattern was clear enough to change their status. Families who had accepted natural causes were finally given answers. The truth was painful, but it replaced years of uncertainty. The pillow grease mark became a lesson shared among investigators. It showed how small details could carry enormous meaning. It also revealed how systems fail when they rely too heavily on routine conclusions. Calm scenes can be staged. Order can be misleading. Silence can hide intent. Ron Iddles did not celebrate the outcome. He documented it carefully and moved on to the next case. For him, the work was never about recognition. It was about persistence and respect for details others overlooked. He believed that evidence spoke clearly when given time and attention. The case closed with 3 murders officially solved and others acknowledged. It reshaped how similar deaths were reviewed across the region. Pillowcases, fabrics, and overlooked surfaces were no longer ignored. Investigators learned to question what felt ordinary. In the end, the most important clue was not dramatic or violent. It was a faint mark that blended into fabric, dismissed as wear and tear. It waited patiently, surviving time, routine, and assumption. All it needed was someone willing to look twice. The city returned to its normal rhythm. Most people never learned how close danger had been or how long it had had. But the truth remained recorded in evidence logs and case notes. A reminder that justice sometimes arrives not with noise but with careful eye.